Continuing from our previous discussion on the philosophical development of Pyrrhonism, let's now explore a more profound question. What does it actually mean to live as a skeptic? In today's philosophical landscape, this idea often sounds rather peculiar. Most contemporary philosophers don't exactly see themselves as skeptics. Rather, skepticism is often viewed as a problem to be tackled, a challenge to be overcome. Even when someone finds a skeptical argument, say, about our knowledge of the external world, convincing, they rarely conclude that skepticism itself is the correct stance. Instead, the reaction might be, okay, we need to figure out why this line of thinking is flawed, or perhaps understand how our everyday ways of knowing can still be reliable despite these arguments. It's like acknowledging a glitch in the system but insisting the system itself is fundamentally sound. Now, this contrasts sharply with ancient Greek skepticism, particularly during the Hellenistic period. Thinkers like Pyrrho and Sextus Empiricus weren't just armchair theorists. They envisioned skepticism as something you could live by. It wasn't an abstract puzzle, it was a practical approach to navigating life. And because of this, they had to grapple with a serious objection. If you truly suspend judgment on everything, how can you possibly act? How do you choose between options? This wasn't just a philosophical quip, it was a real challenge to the viability of their entire project. So this chapter aims to unpack what living as a skeptic actually looked like back then, and whether any version of this ancient idea might still hold water or even be valuable for us today. So, what's the core technique here? For the Pyrrhonists, especially as detailed by Sextus Empiricus, it's suspension of judgment, or epoche. Imagine being presented with a complex issue, say the nature of causality. You systematically lay out all the arguments for determinism, then all the arguments for free will, then maybe some quantum mechanical weirdness thrown in. The key is to present them in such a way that each side seems equally compelling, equally well supported. No side feels stronger than the other. When you reach that point of perfect balance, you simply stop taking sides. You suspend your judgment. This wasn't just about philosophical debates, the goal was universal suspension across all domains. Interestingly, even earlier in the Pyrrhonist tradition, and certainly in the skeptical phase of the Academy, though they didn't call themselves skeptics, this kind of dialectical exercise aimed at balanced consideration was central. This brings us directly to the apraxia problem. If you're suspending judgment on everything, including whether actions are good or bad, true or false, how do you pick up a cup of coffee? How do you decide where to go? The critics argued that without firm beliefs guiding your choices, action becomes impossible. Now, Sextus himself focused heavily on theoretical issues, questioning the very foundations of things like motion, time, and truth. But the critics rightly pointed out that if suspension applies to practical matters too, then paralysis should follow. Both the academics and the Pyrrhonists had to counter this. The academics, Arcesilaus and Carneades, suggested that even while suspending judgment on ultimate truths, we can still be swayed by more persuasive impressions, allowing us to choose and act without committing to definitive truth claims. Sextus, however, offered a different path. Follow the appearances, look around. Things appear to move, to exist, to have qualities. These everyday experiences, these phenomena, are enough to guide our actions. We don't need to know the metaphysical essence of motion to decide whether to cross the street safely. It's about acting based on what seems to be, not what we believe is ultimately real. So if suspension of judgment is compatible with action, what's the point? Why bother? For the Pyrrhonists, the payoff is ataraxia, tranquility, peace of mind, freedom from worry. The idea is that holding strong opinions, especially about controversial or deeply uncertain things, creates inner turmoil. You worry about being wrong, about defending your views, about the implications of what you believe. By suspending judgment, you cut yourself off from that source of anxiety. Sextus tells two interesting stories about how this works. First, imagine someone desperately seeking truth, hoping it will bring peace. But they find that every argument has a counter-argument, leaving them stuck. Realizing the futility of the search for absolute truth, they discover that simply stopping the search, suspending judgment, is the tranquility they sought all along. Second, think about the constant stress people feel because they believe certain things are objectively good or bad. The skeptic, by definition, lacks these beliefs. They don't hold on to the idea that wealth is inherently good or poverty bad, or that specific political outcomes are objectively right or wrong. This lack of commitment frees them from the immense anxiety that comes with holding such high stakes. What does this skeptical life actually look like day to day? Well, it's primarily a life dedicated to a specific kind of philosophical activity. Think of it less like proposing a theory and more like running a rigorous debate club against yourself. The skeptic constantly engages in this process of weighing arguments for and against various positions. Sextus calls this their ability, their dunamis. It's the skill of arranging opposing considerations so perfectly balanced that they achieve equal strength, leading inevitably to suspension. Crucially, this isn't a one-time achievement. It's an ongoing practice. Why? Because the mind is slippery. We tend to drift back into holding definite beliefs. So the skeptic needs to regularly rehearse these balanced arguments, like a mental workout, to maintain the state of suspension and avoid falling back into the turmoil of dogmatism. This is where the famous modes come in handy, standardized techniques for generating these balanced perspectives. While Sextus calls it an inquiry, skepsis, it's important to note that this isn't really about finding truth anymore. It's about maintaining the condition of suspension, which is the means to achieving tranquility. It's inquiry in service of peace of mind, not inquiry for its own sake. Okay, so the skeptic suspends judgment on grand metaphysical questions, but how do they navigate the world? They follow appearances. Sextus lists four main types. First, the guidance of nature, our basic senses and cognitive habits. We see things a certain way, think in logical sequences, avoid contradictions. These are just how we are wired. Second, necessity of affection, basic biological drives. Get hungry? Eat? Thirsty? Drink. No complex reasoning needed there. Third, handing down of laws and customs, social norms. This is trickier. Does following societal rules imply believing they're objectively right? Sextus suggests a way out. The skeptic acts according to custom simply because it's customary, ingrained through upbringing, not because they endorse the underlying principles. Think of it as cultural conformity without cultural conformism. Fourth, teaching of forms of expertise, practical skills. Learning to ride a bike, swim, or drive a car involves mastering techniques, knowing how, not necessarily absorbing a whole body of theoretical knowledge, knowing that. Even Sextus, a physician, emphasized empirical methods over speculative theories in medicine. So the skeptic goes about their daily life, seemingly indistinguishable from anyone else. They eat, drink, follow customs, practice skills. But internally, things are radically different. They're described as having a kind of conformity without conformism. They follow the crowd, but not because they agree with the crowd's reasons or values. Their actions are driven by ingrained dispositions, not conscious choices based on belief. How do they get here? Through that intense, deliberate process of examining all possible theories, including ethical ones, and then suspending judgment on them all. The result? A profound passivity. Actions happen, but the agent is detached, almost like an observer watching their own body move according to preset programs. There's no deep investment, no real ownership of the actions. If we think of a self as defined by our core concerns and commitments, the skeptic doesn't really fit that mold. Their concerns are dictated by circumstance, but they lack the emotional or intellectual engagement that makes those concerns truly part of who they are. They are, in a sense, less of an agent, less of a self. All right, fascinating stuff. But does this ancient model hold up for us today? Let's consider. First, is tranquility really the top priority for most modern people? Many of us value things like meaning, purpose, connection, achievement, which might conflict with the radical disengagement required for Sextus's ataraxia. Is giving up a strong sense of self-worth too high a price for peace of mind? Second, remember that story about freedom from value beliefs? For many people today, especially in a secularized world, the thought that nothing is truly good or bad can feel less like liberation and more like despair, a sense of meaninglessness. Thinkers like Nietzsche urged people to create their own values, while existentialists emphasized radical choice to find meaning. These are paths of engagement, the opposite of Sextus's detachment. Third, can we even suspend judgment on most things anymore? Science has given us answers Sextus couldn't have imagined. We know germ theory, relativity, genetics. Suspending judgment on these is simply not an option for functioning in our world. Universal suspension is only really feasible in areas like ethics, religion, or philosophy itself, where fundamental disagreements persist. So, if we ditch the idea of skepticism as a guaranteed path to tranquility, and acknowledge that universal suspension isn't really possible, what's left? Perhaps a more scaled-down, contemporary version of skepticism. The core idea remains: critically examine arguments on all sides, be wary of dogmatic pronouncements, and when the evidence genuinely seems balanced, be willing to admit you don't know. This isn't about achieving a specific mental state like ataraxia, but about cultivating intellectual honesty and rigor. Could this be useful? Maybe. Individually, it might lead to some calmness, or at least the satisfaction of doing the right thing intellectually, even if it feels unsettling. More broadly, in a society increasingly divided by entrenched values and misinformation, could widespread critical thinking and a healthy dose of skepticism help bridge divides, reduce polarization, and promote more reasoned discourse? Sextus himself spoke of skeptics being philanthropic, wishing to cure the rashness of dogmatists. While his full-blown method might be impractical, fostering a skeptical temperament, a willingness to question assumptions and weigh evidence carefully, seems like something potentially very valuable for us today. Now let's shift gears slightly. We've talked about the skeptical path, but what about the goal? What did the ancients mean by living well? Aristotle, for instance, takes it as a given that eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, is the highest good. Everyone agrees, he says, that living well means being eudaimon. His job in the ethics is to figure out what that actually entails. Now, eudaimonia isn't just feeling happy right now, it's about the overall quality of one's life. It's the state where, looking back, you can say your life went well. Given that ancient philosophy was deeply practical, aiming to improve life, it makes perfect sense that the skeptics would also frame their philosophy in terms of achieving eudaimonia. Could their skeptical approach actually lead to a good life? How did the academics, Arcesilaus and Carneades, connect skepticism to eudaimonia? Again, it comes up in response to the apraxia problem. If you can't hold beliefs, how do you live a good life? Arcesilaus, according to Sextus, argued that the skeptic chooses actions based on what is reasonable, and this path leads to happiness, which is the ultimate aim of life. Carneades offered a more elaborate scheme involving decision-making based on persuasive appearances, suggesting that the strongest level of persuasion is what guides choices related to happiness. The key takeaway here is that both academics were trying to reassure critics that embracing skepticism wouldn't prevent you from achieving the good life. In fact, they presented it as a viable, perhaps even superior, route to eudaimonia. The Pyrrhonists, however, took this claim even further. They weren't just saying skepticism is compatible with eudaimonia. They consistently portrayed the skeptical way of life as the path to genuine happiness, and indeed, as making their adherents happier than anyone else, particularly other philosophers. This seems to be a recurring theme throughout the Pyrrhonian tradition, even in its earliest phases. So, for the Pyrrhonists, the skeptical lifestyle wasn't just a neutral alternative. It was presented as the superior way to live, the one that actually delivers the goods, the eudaimonia that everyone seeks. So, wrapping up this exploration, we see that ancient skepticism wasn't just about doubting things. It was a comprehensive way of life aimed at achieving tranquility through the suspension of judgment and following appearances. While Sextus's vision of a universally applicable method leading reliably to peace of mind faces significant hurdles in our modern context, the core idea of critical balanced scrutiny retains considerable value. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of ancient skepticism lies not in adopting their entire system, but in cultivating a skeptical attitude, a commitment to intellectual honesty and open-mindedness, which can benefit both individual well-being and the health of our societies. The ancient quest for eudaimonia, the good life, continues to resonate, inviting us to reflect on how we navigate uncertainty and strive for a meaningful existence.